So this video is about the start of chapter 6. To date we've been talking about classification of organisms, and then we talked about viruses, how they don't fall into the living organisms category. We talked about the other kingdoms, so kingdom Bacteria, kingdom Archaea, kingdom Protista, kingdom Fungi, and now we're moving on to chapter 6, which deals with kingdoms Plantae and Animalia. And the first part of chapter 6 is kind of an overview. So chapter 6 section 1 is a little bit of an overview of plants and animals, and kind of compares some of their basic features. So we'll take a look at it. So the characteristics that plants have in common are that they are multicellular, and they're eukaryotes. Animals are too. But they have a cell wall. And fungi also have a cell wall, but plant cell walls have a different material in them. Fungi had chitin, but plants have cellulose, which has the benefit of providing us with roughage. But for plants, it's a really important structural component that gives them the firmness so that they can have protection, and also allow them to stand up straight whenever they're watered enough. They're almost all autotrophic, so they can make their own food through photosynthesis. They are non-motile or sessile, whereas animals are motile, right? They're terrestrial, or land dwellers, and they have a special kind of reproductive strategy called alternation of generations. So we're going to take a closer look at that. And basically it means that we're going to go between two different life forms, or different body forms. So one of the objectives that you had is to look at some of the adaptations that plants needed to move on to land, to be terrestrial. So you can read about it in that section of the textbook, and this is just a graphic that kind of shares some of those features. Basically the modern plants had first evidence of living on Earth about 450 million years ago. They were similar to mosses and club mosses at those times, as well as lichen, which we saw in the fungi chapter. But they required things like adaptations to protect them from drying out. So they have a special waxy cuticle coating, for instance, that is on the outside of their tissues in order to prevent water loss. They have special adaptations in that they can produce seeds, the higher level ones, so that their gametes or sex cells won't dry out. They needed to be able to support their own weight, because things that were in the water were kind of supported by the water, but if they're living on land, then they needed to be able to hold themselves up. So they have stems, for instance. And they also needed a way of transporting water and nutrients throughout their bodies. So the higher level plants have something called vascular tissue. Okay, so those are some of the adaptations. There are others too. It's a good idea to take a look at that section in the book. 3 main parts of plants: roots, leaves, and stems. So you should know the function of each. Roots are really important for anchoring the plant into the ground. Most times roots will be found under the ground itself, and sometimes they become exposed. They anchor them there so that they can't easily be knocked over or uprooted if it happens to be windy or things like that. They're also important for absorbing nutrients and water. Leaves, like these ones here, are important for providing a greater surface area to expose their chloroplasts with chlorophyll in them so that they can catch the light from the sun and undergo photosynthesis. So the leaves are important because they're the site of photosynthesis. There's some photosynthesis in other green parts of the plants, but the leaves give them the greater surface area to trap the sunlight. On the undersurface, we had taken a look at the little stomata, the little holes that the gases can pass through, and so they're found on the underside so that they kind of have protection from debris and other things that could fall on the top of the leaves. Stems, like these here, are important for providing support and holding the upper part of the plant, which usually involves the leaves, higher towards the sun. They're also important for conducting materials between the top and bottom parts of the plant. So we talked about vascular tissue, and if you think about it, plants have vascular tissue just like we do. So not all plants do, just like not all animals have vascular tissue, but those that are higher level require vascular tissue in order to make sure that water and nutrients get to all parts of the plant, because they are multicellular and larger and have to rely on a means of getting the material to the different regions. So our vascular tissue are our blood vessels, for instance. The easiest example to think of is when you cut through a piece of celery, these little circles that you see are the vascular bundles, the little vascular tissue columns. We call them xylem and phloem. We'll take a closer look at them later. But basically they carry water and nutrients through the plant. They're linked from the roots right up to the highest parts of the plant. So when we're classifying plants, they're divided into two main groups based on whether or not they have the vascular tissue. So there's vascular plants, which include most of the plants, 3 of the 4 groups we're going to talk about, and non-vascular plants. And the non-vascular plants include these types along the bottom. So they include mosses, and these are liverworts and hornworts that look like horns. Now these plants are so small and low to the ground because they don't have vascular tissue to allow them to kind of get bigger, that they don't have true stems, roots, or leaves. Sexual reproduction in plants. Yes, we've been saying all along, plants have sex. It's kind of strange to think that way, and you certainly would never have probably thought of it when you were first learning about plants when you were little, but they do, and it requires water or protection so that the gametes won't dry out. Seedless plants need to have water so that the sperm can swim to the egg. So dewdrops, for instance, or rain will help to get the sperm to the egg for fertilization to happen. Seed plants, those that produce seeds, need wind or insects or other animals or water in order to help disperse the pollen that they produce, and the pollen has sperm in them that will be able to get to the egg. But pollen offers the benefit of being waterproof, and it prevents them from drying out, protects the gametes. Pollen grains contain the sperm, so there's certain cells in them that will develop into the sperm, and so when the pollen lands on the part of the flower or in the cone on a cone-bearing tree, then they'll form a pollen tube for the sperm to swim through down to where the egg is. Once fertilization happens, a zygote is formed. It's the same thing as in us. So when the egg and the sperm unite when production of a human, the first cell that's made is called a zygote. Now for a plant, the zygote develops inside of a seed if they're a seed-producing plant. So the seeds, like what we see in an apple or in a tomato or in sunflower seeds, they contain an embryo, stored food, and a tough waterproof coat that will allow them to be dormant until conditions are just right. And the conditions have to be just right. That's why, like I said in class, that's why we don't tend to grow apple trees in our bellies when we eat them. So this is just an overview of what we mean by alternation of generations. And the life cycle looks a little bit different for each type of plant. But in general, the same kind of pattern is going to show up when you look at them. So what we mean by alternation of generations is the plant will go through two different kind of life forms. So they'll go through a haploid gametophyte stage and a diploid sporophyte stage. Now, haploid just means that they have half the number of chromosomes. So our egg and sperm cells, for instance, ours have haploid. They are called haploid because they have half the number of chromosomes. And that makes sense because when the egg and the sperm come together and fuse, then we get diploid zygote. Okay, and that has two copies of each chromosome, one from the mom, one from the dad. Okay, so we use letter N to designate a copy of chromosomes. So haploid would be N, and diploid, say diploid has di at the front, so diploid is 2N because they have two copies of the chromosomes. Probably the easiest way to remember or keep track of which is which is the first part of the name refers to what that life form is going to make. So the gametophyte makes gametes, and that means sex cells, so egg and sperm. The sporophyte is going to produce spores, and phyte means plant. So the gametophyte is the plant form that produces gametes, and the sporophyte is the plant form that produces spores. So if we look, okay, well here's the gametophyte. The gametophyte is going to make egg and sperm, and the egg and sperm are haploid. Fertilization happens where they fuse, and they form a diploid, or 2N, zygote. As soon as the zygote divides even once, so it goes from one cell into two, they divide by mitosis, that's the process that happens. Once it divides even once, we refer to it as an embryo. Okay, so the embryo is developing then into a grown-up sporophyte. Inside of the sporophyte, meiosis will happen. Meiosis is the process that happens in order to divide the chromosomes into half the number of chromosomes. Okay, so meiosis will happen to give a haploid spores. And the haploid spores are going to land and form the gametophyte part. Okay, so this whole side here, this whole side is haploid. And then this whole side is diploid. So from the time it becomes a zygote until meiosis happens to form the spores, then that stage is diploid. Okay? Now, when we talk about the plants, what we see and think of as the plant is going to be what we call the dominant stage, or the dominant generation. The only ones that have a dominant gametophyte are the non-vascular plants, so like mosses. All the rest, the dominant plant that we see as being the plant, like an apple tree or a rose bush or a spruce tree or a fern, they are all sporophyte dominant. So what we see as the plant is the sporophyte. Okay, and this one is just a slide that is describing exactly what I said, but in written form for you. So you can read it for yourself when you have the notes, if you like. And this is a graphic showing an example for ferns, and it's just a basic example. We're going to look at one in a little more detail when we talk about the ferns, but so we said with the fern, the dominant generation is a sporophyte. So here's the fern that we see. It's a sporophyte, so it is diploid. There's part of it that's going to undergo what we call meiosis to form haploid spores. Okay, so the spores are kind of in the pink area, showing what things are haploid. So the haploid spores will land on the ground, and they will produce, excuse me, a gametophyte. And the gametophyte is kind of cool. It's heart-shaped, and we call it a prothallus, so it has a special name. And on the gametophyte, there's male and female parts that will make gametes. That's why we call it the gametophyte generation. So it will make the male gametes, which are sperm, and female gametes, which are eggs. Fertilization will happen, and again, we're going to look at this a little closer. And all of a sudden, the sporophyte, a baby sporophyte, will grow up out of this gametophyte. So it'll grow off of it, but it'll be a lot bigger than it. Okay, so the prothallus would be a tiny little thing down here, and then the sporophyte is going to grow up out of that and be quite a bit larger. Okay, so this is just kind of a general overview of how it would work in ferns. The last part of that section talks briefly about characteristics of animals and the things that they are classified based on, just for comparison to plants. So like plants, animals are multicellular and they're eukaryotes. Unlike plants, they lack cell walls. So we don't have any cell walls. We reproduce sexually, like plants do. Some animals, some of the earlier animal forms can reproduce asexually as well. Excuse me. Through budding and binary fission and regeneration. We're all heterotrophs, so we have to consume other things in order to get our energy. We can't make our own food. And we are motile. So those are characteristics of animals. You should be able to tell me some things that are common between plants and animals and some things that are different. In terms of classifying animals, there's two main large groups, vertebrates and invertebrates. So vertebrates include a lot of the animals that we grew up thinking of as animals, but they really only make up about 5% of all animals. Invertebrates, on the other hand, make up almost all the rest. So they have no backbone, whereas vertebrates like us have a backbone. The characteristics used to classify animals into phyla include the number of germ layers, digestive tract type, whether it's complete or incomplete, body symmetry, development of an internal body cavity or coelom, and their type of reproduction. So they can all reproduce sexually, but is that external or internal fertilization, and how do the young develop, that sort of thing. So we will look at these in a little more detail when we get to the animal section. And that is it for this section. There's some questions you can do to review. But if you do have questions about that, please ask anytime.